Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you may be. So welcome to our AWS workshop series, Navigating the Jungle Terrains of AWS. And we're very, very excited to launch this series today. And we already have a very good crowd, so we'll get started. So we decided to launch this series because, as most of you know already, AWS is the clear cloud computing market leader. And the industry is seeing over the years a huge growth in migration to AWS. But in the many talks that we've had with customers and prospects, we still had the feeling that AWS users weren't fully understanding the underlying mechanisms of the cloud and how to take advantage of the array of AWS services available. And what we saw was that they were really getting lost in what we like to call the jungle that is AWS. So we decided to put together a technical workshop in which we'll have a total of 6 sessions. And we'll discuss topics like cost savings, automation services, backup, security, and as well as how MSPs can especially leverage these features to maximize their bottom line. So this first session is going to be a quick tour around AWS. And we want to introduce the services to you, especially if you are relatively new to the topic. And then we'll also spend a bit of time explaining how to get started, how these services work together, and what your responsibility is as an AWS customer. Okay, great. So just a bit of housekeeping items. Sebastian, we can move over to the next slide. We can move over to the next slide, Sebastian.
Oh, the before we begin? It's on the screen now.
Okay. So this webinar is being recorded and will be sent via email. And all of you lucky viewers will receive $50 in AWS promo credits, which will be sent directly to your inbox in 7 business days. Okay, cool. And now, intro. So with me today is the one and only Sebastian Straub. He is a system engineer here at N2WS. He has over 20 years of experience in the enterprise security industry, working for a slew of well-known companies such as Department of Defense, Dell, the FBI, and Northrop Grumman. And myself, I'm Jessica. I head up our customer success program here at N2WS, and I have over 15 years of experience in marketing and technical roles in the space. So how did AWS lead such a quick and significant shift from on-premise? So in just 2 years from now, it's predicted that 73% of cloud workloads will be on public data centers. So this is quite the change because just 10 to 12 years ago, if you wanted a server, for example, your IT team would go and buy the infrastructure, and weeks or months later, you'd finally receive the technology to run your app. So then what happened? So AWS finally comes on board, and it became extremely popular because people didn't need to buy infrastructure anymore. They could now provision services using APIs and quickly be able to run email or host websites or run the back end of a mobile app. So this was completely different as to how things used to be. And back in 2006, AWS was the very first cloud service to run this model. So what that means is for AWS users, you can focus on things that are completely unique to your particular business. And currently, AWS provides over 125 services, and it's quite certain that they will continue to lead in market share going forward. Okay, so as I said, today we're going to give you all a quick tour of AWS. So first we're going to talk about global infrastructure. And global infrastructure in AWS is organized into regions, and we'll touch on the reasons we choose different regions and their respective availability zones. We'll touch on network and security and services that further improve your experience by increasing privacy and control network access. We'll talk about core services, including compute services, which make it super easy to spin up a machine, storage services, and the various database services available. We'll talk about administration services to help you provision your infrastructure and automatically manage your computing resource. And finally, we'll talk about protecting your AWS and why it's so crucial and what your responsibility is as an AWS user from a security standpoint. So with that, I hand it over to you, Sebastian.
All right. So if you've seen the 2015 movie Steve Jobs, there's a great scene in that movie with Fassbender and Rogan. And Rogan says, I don't think there's a man who's done more to advance the democratization that comes with personal computing than I have. And Seth Rogen's version of Steve Wozniak declares that in that movie. And I love that scene because it compares to what Amazon AWS has done. Anyone, anywhere has access to the kind of tech resources that previously only large companies could afford. And there's no initial outlay of funds because I don't have to worry about my hardware becoming obsolete because it's all virtual. It's all in the cloud. It's self-renewing. And as Jessica already mentioned, Amazon AWS commands around 40% market share, followed by Microsoft's Azure at a roughly 15%. IBM and Google are probably right below 10%, and the next 10 providers combined make up around 15%. So it's clear to see why AWS is so popular. It's the McDonald's of cloud providers. Love it or hate it, it's here to stay. So let's start with the backbone of the operation, the infrastructure. First, we have regions within the infrastructure. These are multiple locations worldwide. These locations are composed of AWS regions and availability zones, and we'll talk about those zones in a moment. Each AWS region is a separate geographic area. Think of those as your good old-fashioned data center back in the day of on-prem. The only difference is that Jeff Bezos is sweeping the floors now. There are currently 20 regions and counting across the globe. And what's really important is to know that any resources are not replicated across AWS regions unless you do so specifically. So if your data is located in a region on the North American continent, that's where your data is made available from. It's not made available from the European continent. So let's talk about the availability zones. An availability zone is an isolated location inside a region. Each region is made of several availability zones. Each availability zone belongs to a single region. Also, each AZ, that's what the so-called experts call it, is isolated. But the AZs in a region are connected through low latency links. Think of those AZs as different server rooms in your good old-fashioned data center. AWS has different types of resources and services, and you manipulate these services through channels called API endpoints. In order to reduce data latency, AWS provides regional endpoints for each service. So that means I don't have to use a North American API endpoint in order to manipulate my resource, which is actually located in Europe. That'd be crazy. It would be like a modern day version of the telephone game kids used to play. All right, so security. Let's talk about security because nobody likes their company to be the next hacked and breached company. So your virtual private cloud VPC acts as your router or firewall of days gone by. Your VPC allows you to isolate resources in your AWS account and control in a very granular fashion who gets to access those resources. Then subnets allow an even deeper categorizing of your workloads or services. So not much has changed from what we used to have on-prem. You still have the same concepts also in the cloud. So that's what your virtual private cloud, your VPC, allows you to do. Essentially, it's the backbone behind the virtual server infrastructure we'll be talking about in a moment. So as I said, not much has changed. You still have your routers, your switches, and your cabling. It's just all virtual, and it's called a VPC. All right, so compute, storage, and database. So there is obviously some infrastructure in the cloud as well. So the first one that we'll be discussing is the Elastic Compute Cloud, EC2. EC2 instances are essentially virtualized versions of your servers that you used to have on-prem in your server room. And AWS allows you to define how these servers should act and how large you want to make these servers. And as I mentioned before, the nice thing here is that you can scale them up and down as you see fit. You don't have to create an entire server room with X amount of servers and then scale them to a certain size. If you're coming out with a new product and you're expecting a lot of interest in your website, then I can scale up my web server, which I'm hosting in the AWS cloud, accordingly. And the same thing goes for if you're expecting a need for more access to your databases, to your file servers, or even if you need to create clusters of file servers, Active Directory servers, any data that you're hosting in the cloud. That's the huge improvement of the EC2 instances. They're virtualized, virtual machines. You don't have to worry about the underlying hardware architecture anymore. Doesn't matter if a motherboard would fail, if a power supply would fail, because that's what AWS takes care of. That's what they will provide to you. All you have to worry about is really just the data that's stored on there. Which brings us to the different types of storage. Object versus block storage. Well, much has been said about the differences between file storage, object storage, and block storage. So first off, file storage. Well, that's in the good old days when we had files and folders, and kind of sort of goes hand in hand with how we used to do business in a more archaic form with printed papers, with folders, and then you're going to punch holes in them and you're going to store them, which works fine. Somebody on the internet even compared it to, well, if you're storing files, that's a little bit like parking your car yourself in a parking lot, which works fine as long as that parking lot isn't too big. Object storage, on the other hand, that's when you use the valet service. Object storage is the better way of storing information, especially if you're dealing with data backups, archival images, multimedia files, videos, pictures, music, that sort of thing. When that is being stored as an object, then that's where the data is far more accessible. And that's what you have with Amazon S3. Amazon S3 also has the availability that it is redundant, which means that across the availability zones in a region, I have different versions of that data available. So even if something would fail on the back end in the Amazon data center, I don't have to worry about it, because Amazon S3 will automatically repair this data through redundant resources that they're taking care of. So it's not something that I have to worry about. Now, opposite to that, you also have the block storage. So that's slightly different. So Amazon EBS it would compare most likely to your physical hard drives. It's really the type of storage that you want to use if you're expecting a lot of writes and reads and changes and you want to create a real file system. So that's what block file storage will do for you. Block file storage devices are accessible as volumes and accessed directly by the operating system. Some of the drawbacks of block storage, Amazon EBS, is that when you're creating these virtual machine file system volumes, they can only be attached to a single instance at a time. So it's not something that I can share across several different services at once. Another thing that you have to keep in mind is Amazon EBS basically has failure built in. It's part of the design. Amazon EBS is about 20 times more reliable than a physical hard drive, but that still means that you have an annual failure rate of about 0.1 to 0.2%, which then means that if you have 1,000 EBS volumes, virtual hard drives, that you're making use of, you can expect a couple of those to fail every year. And this is not redundant information that's stored anywhere else within the Amazon infrastructure. And the worst part of this is you don't get to choose which of the volumes in your environment are failing. It could be a very important file server, it could be a very important database, perhaps your employee database, or perhaps your customer database. So that's why there's different types of capabilities, how you can store and then create a redundancy of that data yourself. And we'll talk about that in a moment as well. So those are the two differences between S3 and Amazon EBS. All right, databases in the cloud. There are so many different flavors and technologies to choose from. RDS and Aurora are used for traditional applications, such as your inventory or your customer shopping history. Cloud-based databases have the great advantage that there is nearly zero admin time. You don't have to worry about the underlying operating system, patches, updates, or the underlying EC2-based infrastructure. It boils down to your choice of database, and that's all you have to worry about. The main players here are relational and non-relational, or also NoSQL called databases. RDS and Aurora being representative of relational databases. A good example of non-relational databases or NoSQL database would be Amazon DynamoDB. And in the past, before serverless Aurora, the big advantage of DynamoDB was that it's serverless. It prioritizes speed of delivery and minimal configuration. It allows dynamic schemas and is easy to use, especially if you don't know yet what your final data model is going to look like. Generally, DynamoDB performs well in situations where there aren't many data join transactions. A real-world example would be if you're creating an application where the user supplies a list of ingredients and wants every recipe you can make with those ingredients. That would be a perfect case for NoSQL. And conversely, if your goal would be to create an ever-changing inventory of ingredients coming and going from your grocery store, that would be a perfect case for a SQL-type database. In either case, Amazon AWS can offer both services, the databases, not the ingredients for your recipe, just to be clear on this. So up to this point, we heard much about the capabilities of Amazon AWS, but now let's talk about administration. How can I make wielding this much power easy and efficient? As long as you're dealing with single resources, it's okay to spin up and configure systems on the go as needed. However, when you're trying to replicate your entire production stack multiple times for development and testing, you will quickly run into the limitations of doing it on the go. CloudFormation will help you in that situation. It allows you to create a blueprint for your environment, tailored to your goals and needs. And CloudFormation provisions and manages stacks of AWS resources based on templates and automatically deploys them at your say-so. And it's easy to keep track of modifications and updates. CloudFormation also has sample pre-built templates commonly used for certain architecture scenarios. So it makes your rollout of your resources much easier, and it's much easier to manage them as well. Now, AWS Lambda. AWS Lambda is an event-driven serverless computing platform provided by Amazon as part of the Amazon Web Services. It is a computing service that runs code or scripts in response to events and has the ability to manipulate AWS services. A wide variety of computer languages are supported, such as Python, Java, Go, Ruby, and a whole bunch of others. Some runtimes are slower than others, so again, there's quite a bit of uncertainty with that as well. Originally, Lambda was designed for use cases such as manipulation of objects in S3, updates to DynamoDB tables, and reacting to sensor readings of IoT devices. Lambda is very versatile, but in the final analysis, it is essentially a platform for scripting. It doesn't scale very well, and it requires quite a bit of knowledge and maintenance to stay relevant. Lambda doesn't provide very good auditing and reporting. Essentially, you're creating a scripting snippet library, which is great news in job security for the scripting admin, because eventually he's the only one who can make sense of it all. And you're also lacking granular control over who gets to see what and access what. Finally, the moment has arrived. You followed the AWS 101 webinar. You have arrived in the AWS cloud. And now what? Well, everything went smoothly, and you have something like this in the AWS cloud. I have my instances, my databases, my data at large, and of course, my infrastructure in the cloud. What could go wrong now? Well, what you're seeing here, that's the AWS shared responsibility model. It's taken straight from the AWS website. So what you see here at the bottom in yellow, that's what AWS provides. It's the virtual hardware and everything that we described up to this point: compute, storage, databases, networking, the availability zones, the different regions. Now, what you see up top there in blue, that's, and I always joke about this, this is what makes you blue, because guess what? You're responsible for that. And really, nothing has changed. Just like in the past, you're still responsible for your operating system that you're running on that virtualized hardware. You're still responsible for the configuration of the operating system, of the application, of the identity and access management that you build on top of that virtual hardware. And probably most importantly, your data. And that's all the way at the top, because the contents of your databases, and that's what really matters. And for that information, well, you're responsible for this. AWS doesn't provide any backups of this information. So, which means, why do I need to protect my AWS? Wide variety of reasons. Probably the most important is human error. Oops. Nobody likes to hear that word. Oh, I accidentally deleted an instance. I accidentally made some changes. I did something that I shouldn't have done. AZ failures are also common. It does happen. EBS failure. We already talked about this. EBS, literally, when you take a look at the AWS website, has failure built into the design. And as I mentioned before, you don't get to choose which one of your volumes are failing. And also ransomware. It happens. It still happens. That an entire instance might be taken over, might be encrypted. And when that happens, well, how do I get the data back? How do I go back to a point in time where my machine wasn't taken over, where it's not encrypted? Well, as we call it, the promise of the cloud delivered. So in this puzzle here, you see on the left side of the screen what AWS provides you with. APIs and CLI, EBS snapshots, regions and availability zones. We already talked about this. We did talk about that. It's durable storage, especially if you're in S3, and the Lambda scripting. But it's really only one part of the puzzle. And what you're seeing here on the right side of the screen, that's where N2WS enhances your experience. We provide you with a very easy-to-learn, simple UI. I always joke around, I can teach N2WS to somebody in 30 minutes. You don't need to be an expert at AWS to make sure that everything that you're storing and that you're running there is protected. We also provide you with file-level recovery. We'll talk about that in a moment as well. Fully featured disaster recovery, auditing, reporting, and alerting. We did talk about this. That is really something that's lacking within AWS. And of course, also application consistent backup. Crash consistent backups, which you are provided with by AWS, are great, but, well, application consistent backups are what you need for your databases. Because if you're recovering, let's say, a Microsoft SQL database from a crash consistent backup, well, guess what? AWS snapshot recoveries would then say, well, something isn't quite right. I might have not caught the last transaction. So your SQL would then run a consistency check, which, based on the size of the database, can take quite a long time. So that's why application consistent backups are very important. So what's the solution? Well, We believe it's N2WS Backup and Recovery. N2WS Backup and Recovery provides operational backup and disaster recovery purpose-built for AWS. Very easy. It's all policy and schedule driven. It's also very easy to deploy in your environment because it's distributed as an AMI through the AWS Marketplace. In just a few mouse clicks, you can actually make sure that your environment is protected. Also, recovery within moments. That's really our claim to fame, that we have the ability to recover resources within seconds in your environment. And as I already mentioned, it's a very easy to use graphical user interface with dashboards, monitoring, alerting, reporting, and even third-party integration through our API. So one of the things we should talk about, cross-region disaster recovery. So with N2WS, I have the ability to move mountains with a single mouse click. Remember back in the days how you prepared backups, probably with tapes, and then maybe if you had off-site storage, then somebody at the end of the day would come and pick up the tapes from Iron Mountain and then put them in a truck, and that truck would drive across a few time zones, and don't even start talking about recovering that data. Now, within AWS and with the help of N2WS, I have the ability to move my entire corporate data backup across 3 time zones within 2 mouse clicks. That really affords me a whole new level of security and peace of mind. And I can do this across the entire globe, or even drop backups in multiple data centers. We'll take a look at that in a moment as well. Cross-account disaster recovery. Well, that's a whole new level of security as well, because we just discussed, well, cross-region. We already learned about the different regions, but what about different AWS accounts? If you want to sleep well tonight, don't do what I'm going to tell you next. Don't Google the words code spaces. 2 words. CodeSpaces is a company which a few years ago went out of business within 24 hours. They did all the right things. They performed regular backups. They even performed cross-region backups. But then they got hacked. They got compromised. And then the hacker sent them a ransom note and said, pay me up. And they said, we're not going to pay. And then he just simply deleted their entire environment because it's all virtual. There isn't actually a server room anymore. So that's the drawback. What they endured could have been easily avoided if they would have just simply created cross-account disaster recovery backups. So even if your primary account gets hacked, gets compromised, then I can easily fall back on my secondary account and just simply recreate my entire environment using N2WS. We'll see that in a moment. Also, recover a single file or full volume. Remember, we did talk about file-level recovery. Disasters come in all shapes and sizes. It doesn't have to be your entire environment, such as with CodeSpaces, and it doesn't have to be an entire server, or it doesn't even have to be an entire volume. More often than not, it'll probably be, oh, I'm missing that one really important Excel sheet, or I'm missing that really, really important PowerPoint file, or even just a configuration file. With N2WS and our graphical user interface, I can easily browse through my backups and then recover particular information within that backup. So you're being afforded the best of both worlds. The very easy to use and very efficient, very fast snapshots within the EBS, but also the file level recovery as well. Just to go back with what we talked about earlier, it's a little bit like that valet service that we talked about. That comes in really handy. Well, we also discussed the application consistent backups. N2WS includes out-of-the-box support for MySQL, MongoDB, Oracle, Postgres, SQL Server, Exchange, Active Directory, SharePoint, and many, many, many more. N2WS supports application consistent backups across the board for all of these different services. Very important because it will speed up your recovery time. All right, multi-tenancy support with N2WS. We support many AWS accounts from a single N2WS console. Well, why is this useful? Well, it's useful for enterprises with more than one account, and you should have more than one account because that will allow you that cross-account disaster recovery. And also, when you're part of an enterprise which acquires other corporations, well, then eventually you will probably have more than one AWS account. And with N2WS, I can then use that multi-tenancy, the ability to manage resources in different regions, in different accounts. And also for managed service providers, if you have more than a single customer, and I hope you do. Now, with this gives you the ability then to either manage the resources for them or even almost like a self-service portal, give them access to that information. They wouldn't even be aware of the fact that somebody else is using the service as well. All right, so that gets us to a quick demo of N2WS Backup and Recovery. And I love this part. All right, so first off, let's talk about how to get Cloud Protection Manager. As I said, it's pretty simple. It's essentially just an appliance you can pick up in AWS Marketplace. And all you have to do is just choose which region you'd like to deploy it in. We already talked about how the regions work. That entire process doesn't take long.
Sebastian, I believe you need to screen share.
Oh, let me reshare my screen then. There we go.
Yep.
Perfect. All right. So as I said, it's just simply an appliance you can pick up and doesn't take a long time. Takes about 60 seconds or so. Also, it's a very small, very lean infrastructure piece. All we need is a T2 small instance. And we did talk about the different sizing of the different instances, so that is one of the smallest instance types available. Once backup and recovery is spun up, it looks like this. And you can just access this through a web browser. I know, looks a little bit confusing at first, but trust me, in about 10 minutes, you're going to be an absolute expert at this because it really is that simple. You have a little blue band up here with different tabs, Backup Monitor. That's your single pane of glass. This allows you to see all backups that Cloud Protection Manager and Backup and Recovery have performed across all regions and across all different accounts. So I don't have to start looking in my different regions, in my different availability zones for my backups. It's all right here. Of course, I can start filtering this by different policies, by different accounts, and so on. Next to that, you have policies and schedules, and I did mention that Backup and Recovery is policy and schedule driven. Don't worry, I'm not going to bore you by showing you how to create schedules, but let's take a quick look at how to create these policies. How do I define what I want to back up? So I can create a new policy, and I can associate a policy to an AWS account. And I can also associate that policy to a Backup and Recovery user or groups of users. So theoretically, I could allow a database admin to access only his resources and nothing else. So that allows me to be very granular with who gets to see something and what do they get to do with that information. And generations to save, as you probably assumed, that's your retention period. And then down here, then I can associate a policy to a schedule, and I can also associate it to multiple schedules, which makes it really easy to create that grandfather, father-son methodology. So still, how can we define what we want to back up? See, over here, I already have a policy in place, and over here on the right side of the screen, that's my backup targets. If I select this, remember earlier when we talked about the different services that are available in AWS? Well, they're all right here. I can add instances plus all of the volumes that are attached to an instance. N2WS Backup and Recovery works like your brain. When you're thinking servers, you're not thinking about particular hard drives, you're thinking about the entire entity. And that's exactly how this works as well. I don't have to start thinking, okay, so which volumes do I need to back up and how do I reassemble them using the native tools that AWS does provide me with. N2WS Backup and Recovery does all of the hard work for you. Now, if you really wanted to, you do have that option to back up volumes by themselves. Our customers usually choose unattached volumes, data at rest, that sort of thing. You can also back up RDS databases, all the different flavors that they're out there, and Aurora clusters, Redshift clusters, and also, of course, DynamoDB tables. Now, let's say I wanted to add another instance to this. All I have to do is click on the plus sign. Then I can browse through the different regions that I have access to based on the policy we just created. And then I just simply choose what I want to back up and click Add Selected. And that's really all there is to it. It's all menu driven. It's all graphical user interface driven. At that point, N2WS Backup and Recovery will then create what we call operational backups of the data into the same region where the data is currently residing. Remember when I mentioned earlier that, well, data isn't being shared across different regions. So if a region would fail, which has happened before, a few months ago, for example, East 1, North Virginia, went down for an extended period of time, which was kind of hilarious because that's when we all realized that even portions of Amazon are located in the AWS cloud. Suddenly Alexa couldn't talk anymore, she wouldn't play any of my playlists, and even some corporate websites went down for an extended period of time. So you are responsible to create redundant backups of the EBS data in other regions. And N2WS Backup and Recovery makes this very, very easy for you. All you have to do is click on the Disaster Recovery button. It's right here. Now here I can turn on, well, I want to create backups in other regions, and you can also choose which regions you want to create this data in. Now in my case, the workloads that we just looked at, they're all located in North Virginia. And that's why I usually choose Ohio to be my disaster recovery region, because nothing bad ever happens in Ohio. But if you are so inclined and you think, well, what happens if multiple regions would go down? You can do that as well. All you have to do is just simply choose additional regions where backup and recovery will then create these backups. And as you can see at this point, we really have a backup available on every continent, and really only an Earth-ending event would bring down our infrastructure. And I think at that point, we're all looking for food and shelter. Now, down here, that's my cross-account disaster recovery. Remember when we talked about that it's really advisable to have an additional backup, not just in another geographical region in one other AWS data center, but also have a backup in a completely separate, unrelated AWS account. And as I mentioned, it's really just 2 mouse clicks. You just enable it and choose the account where you want to prepare that backup. And then that really gives you that ultimate peace of mind. So that's how we perform backups. But all the backups in the world aren't going to do you much good if it's very difficult and time-consuming to get the data back into play. How do I get the information back into my regions, back into my different accounts? That's very simple. So the backup monitor, that's my single pane of glass. That's where all my journeys start. Let's say I wanted to recover my Windows file servers. Then I would just simply filter by this. And as you can see, I'm performing daily backups. But when I use N2WS Backup and Recovery, I can perform backups far more frequently. Performing daily backups is really a legacy approach. Once you're in the cloud, you could perform backups every 5, 10, 15 minutes. That's completely doable. That's because that Amazon EBS storage is so fast and so efficient. And then worst case scenario, really, I'm only losing what happened in the last 5 minutes instead of losing out on the last 24 hours. So I'm going to make a decision now. And that's the data set that I want to recover. I'm going to click on Recover. Because we did configure this with disaster recovery in mind, that's why you're seeing these 3 menus up here. So you can restore the data either to the region where the data originally came from, or in my case, my disaster recovery region, Ohio. And I also have the option to restore the data in a different AWS account, and I can also restore the data from my other separate AWS account, because I created a disaster recovery backup in that account. And these 3 menus that you're seeing here, they are completely mix and match, which means I could create some really crazy configurations, such as, Let's recover it from my secondary account into my primary account, into my disaster recovery region. Some of our customers actually utilize backup and recovery to migrate data from one account to another, from one region to another. And then over here on the right side of the screen, those are my actual recover modes. We have 3 different modes. The first one is instance recovery. This will allow me to recover an entire instance, plus all of the volumes, without having to figure out how do I reattach them and how do I actually puzzle all of this together. N2WS Backup and Recovery, once again, will do all the hard work for you because it has all of that metadata already stored, and will actually perform a recovery in a moment. You see exactly what I'm talking about. Next to that, we have volumes-only recovery. Well, maybe the entire instance is still active. I just need to recover certain volumes, certain hard drives within that instance. Well, we can do that as well. If I choose that, then here in this case, you can see I have multiple volumes, and I get to choose which volumes I want to recover. And all of the information that you see here, that's not for show. I can make changes to this. So if I wanted to change the type, or if I wanted to change the IOPS, I can do that as well. I also have the option to switch attach volumes and delete the old ones. The way I usually visualize this feature to customers is think of an old-fashioned physical server. Hard drive crashes, terrible things happen, what am I going to do? I'll just pull out the hard drive and replace it with my cloned backed up drive. And that's exactly how this works as well. And it's probably the least intrusive because nothing really changes. The VPC stays the same, the subnet stays the same, the IP address stays the same, and if there is a database on that instance, then even the connection string to that database would stay exactly the same. And then last but not least, I also have that Explore functionality. Explore allows me to actually dig into the currently selected backup file and then retrieve specific folders, specific files from the backup without having to restore the entire instance or having to restore the entire volume. So as we talked about before, disasters come in all shapes and sizes. So this really takes it far beyond what I normally get with the native tools. All right, well, I would say let's actually perform a recovery so you get to see that as well, because as I mentioned, that's really our claim to fame. So let's do this with a Linux-based instance. So I'm going to click on Recover. And I have different instances here, and this isn't an all or nothing. I can actually pick and choose which instance I want to recover. So let's say we want to recover the MySQL instance right here. So if I click on Instance Recovery, then we get to choose more options. That's the metadata that I was talking about. So N2WS Backup and Recovery records all the necessary metadata, which VPC, which subnet was used, what's the actual IP address, the security groups that were assigned to that instance, the instance type. Remember, we talked about different types and different sizes of these instances. Now, if I wanted to make a change to this, I could. All I have to do is click here and make a change. I can also choose a different subnet if I wanted to, different VPC, different security group. We also preserve tags. All the information within AWS has tags. This allows you to categorize your information very easily. Now, what we do is we preserve these tags, allow you to run reports based on these tags, and then when we recover the data, then we will reapply these tags to the recovered data as well. Now, in my case, I don't use static IP, so let me get rid of this, and then down here, that's my Recover Instance button. So if I click on this, it's going to say, well, are you sure you want to do this? You want to recover this entire instance? Sure, absolutely, because we're in the cloud. That's how fast everything works. Operation succeeded, one instance was launched. Now, if I take you to my EC2 console, I'm just going to refresh that screen. We'll actually be able to watch this data being reconstituted right in front of our eyes. It really is that fast. There it is. Now, that virtual hardware is currently being spun up. Can you imagine doing this in an on-prem data center? Is absolutely crazy. Now, that data is still in pending, and it's probably going to stay like that for another 20, 25 seconds or so. You see this button here, it's still yellow. The moment that button turns green, because of a feature that Amazon calls lazy loading, that instance will be fully functional and operational. It means I can immediately access this information. So in case of my SQL database, right now, I can already start hitting it with SQL transactions. Not going to time out, not going to get any errors, nothing like that. That's why N2WS Backup and Recovery is truly the fastest solution out there. Nothing is faster. We did talk about the ability to manage multiple AWS accounts when you do this under accounts. Well, this allows me to perform backups in each of these accounts, but I also have the option to go cross-account as well. So this then allows me to create that disaster recovery cross-account. Remember, we did talk about who should be able to access these backups and what exactly do they get to do, and that's what you can define here. We also support identity service providers, so if you have Active Directory Federation services or any SAML-based single sign-on solution, that's going to work just fine. All of this also comes with detailed auditing. It's just the kind of stuff you don't get with the native tools. So if somebody would say, hey, can you tell me what a certain person has been up to in our environment? Absolutely. The kind of auditing that you would expect. I can see if somebody logs in, logs out, performs configuration changes, does a recovery of information. Anything you can do in Cloud Protection Manager is actually audited down to the minute. So if you would have a disgruntled employee who's doing things they shouldn't be doing, you would very quickly find out about that. Now, all the way here at the bottom, I have access to additional reports. So if I needed to prove to an auditor that we are performing backups, I can do that, backup view report. And if I wanted to have a little bit more insight in these backups, even down to the actual snapshot being performed within my AWS infrastructure, that would be this report. One thing I can absolutely guarantee you, because it happens every single time, when you start using N2WS Backup and Recovery, the question usually comes up, what are we not backing up? And that's this report right here, Unprotected Resources Report. Or we can also inverse that question into, well, show me everything that we are backing up. That's the protected resources. So now we talked about auditing and reporting. And we did talk about this earlier, but almost as important is notifications. Now, how am I going to find out when things happen within my AWS infrastructure? So down here with notifications, I can define a daily summary. Thumbs up, everything is going fine. But if things aren't going so fine, then I also have the option to trigger alerts. Let's say a region is down, and that's why we can back up from that region. Now, backup and recovery would then immediately let you know about that. N2WS Backup and Recovery also has the option to recover itself, because we are another instance in your environment, and then within that, if that region would fail, we have the ability to back up our own configuration settings. They're right here. That's my very first backup policy. In case of an outage, how do I get to this data? Well, I have it configured to perform a disaster recovery backup into Ohio. I also have the option to define it into another account. How do I get a hold of this data? Pretty simple, through the AWS Marketplace. Remember, all I have to do is just simply then spin up backup and recovery in my disaster recovery region or in my disaster recovery account. And once it spins up, it will ask you. It will ask, are you spinning up a new version, or are you performing a disaster recovery? If I say, oh, no, this is a disaster recovery, then it would just offer to import that data that I already stored in my disaster recovery region and my disaster recovery account. So then the next thing is we do support application consistent backups. So any data that you might have, Exchange servers, database servers, doesn't matter if it's Windows or Linux based, N2WS Backup and Recovery can easily deal with this as well. Anything that you've seen me do up to this point was very manual. I had to choose which instances I want to protect, which volumes I want to protect, but you can do the same thing automatically. We have a custom tag called CPM Backup within your environment. And then when you launch new instances, just simply fill that tag with the name of a policy you want Cloud Protection Manager to use to back up your instance. And then it will automatically be included. Now, one more thing. Everybody loves saving money. Now, what we're doing here is we're preparing backups in the AWS infrastructure. And we did talk about the differences between EBS and S3. Well, S3 is also cheaper than the EBS storage. All of these backups that we discussed up to this point, well, they're stored in EBS. We did talk about it. It's very fast, very efficient. But what about the backups that I don't need immediately? How about the long-term storage, the long-term archival of these backups? We do have that ability as well. So you have here S3 repositories. S3 repositories gives me the ability to define different S3 buckets to be used as a long-term recovery. Now, if I go back to Home, to Policies, and then I'm going to go to Copy to S3, this is where I can define in a very granular fashion how long do I want to retain these backups in S3. 14 days, weeks, months, or even years. You can configure this completely to your needs. And that's going to save you quite a bit of money because S3 is much cheaper than the EBS backups, between 40 and 50% cheaper. So this will drastically reduce your storage costs. If you're already in AWS, just simply look at your AWS bill, take a look at the storage. Most of that cost is probably backups. And N2WS Backup and Recovery can almost cut that number in half. All right, well, now, apart from the S3 repositories, how do I get the data back from an S3 repository? It's not any more difficult than the recovery that you've already seen. Remember, that's the policy that we recovered. So if I click on recover, there's no learning curve to recover something from an S3 long-term repository. All I have to do is restore from my S3 repository, and I make the same selections as before, with the added bonus that I don't actually have to define a disaster recovery region. I can recover into any region. So if, for whatever reason, my boss would say, well, I want everything recovered in, Frankfurt, I can do that at the drop of a hat. It really is that easy. It's very fast. Now, remember earlier when we talked about infrastructure, what goes along with your data, with your instances, is also the infrastructure such as VPC settings, subnet settings, security groups, and your routing tables. That information can also be backed up using N2WS. And the way I roll out this configuration into another region is very simple. All I have to do is click on Accounts, Clone VPCs, and then I can choose the settings that we recorded and also the time when we recorded those settings. And then I can just simply clone these settings into another region. Because remember, the settings that are in one region are not automatically in the next, in the region where you want to deploy your infrastructure to in case of a disaster. So all I would have to do then is clone that into that region and hit this button. That entire process takes about 30 seconds. If you really wanted to, you even have the option to export this entire configuration that you see here into a CloudFormation template. Remember, we did talk about CloudFormation templates, and that's essentially a blueprint to recreate your environment. If you wouldn't want to use N2WS to perform the cloning for you, you could even do it within the CloudFormation as well. So that's a very high-level overview of N2WS Backup and Recovery. That really allows you to be a lot more granular with what you're trying to recover and what you're trying to store. It makes it much more simple. So now you have the tools that you need to know how to use AWS and also how to make sure that your AWS is also protected as well. All right, let me go back now to our slides because we're not quite done yet. I'm going to share my screen. So here, this is an incomplete list of some of our customers. What you see here are makers of flavored sugar water, space exploration, manufacturers of guided missile systems and submarines, insurance companies, pharmaceutical vertical, and higher learning. They all utilize and trust N2WS to protect and recover their mission-critical data at the drop of a hat in their AWS accounts in different regions. N2WS is custom-built for AWS, and it was made in the cloud. It was born in the cloud to deal with cloud-era challenges. Hypergrowth of data is like a buzzword that you hear quite a lot, and the hyper availability of that data. That's what N2WS will allow you to do. It allows you to embrace that and have a hyper level resource available. What you're seeing here is actually a review of our solution within the marketplace. So this isn't something that I came up with. No, this is straight from our customers. Also, we talked about earlier about disasters come in all shapes and sizes. So with N2WS, I can go down to the smallest denominator, all the way down to specific particular files within your backups. Our customers really appreciate that flexibility. Old and outdated backups taking up space and money are a thing of the past. You won't have any more orphan backups costing you money because N2WS Backup and Recovery will allow you to stay on top of the maintenance and the pruning of these old backups. So everything really will work automatically in your environment. All right, well, back to you, Jessica.
Okay, thank you so much, Sebastian. That was really, really great. I just wanted to add a few closing notes before we close up here. What Sebastian demonstrated, you can really access every single one of those features and more in our free edition. So just check out our link. BrightTalk will also send you a link with a free trial. And our very own Sebastian hosts an installation video, which you can find as well. And again, as Sebastian mentioned, this was a very high-level overview, and the demo really just touched on some of these features. So please feel free to reach out to us for a more in-depth review or demo with one of our account managers. And lastly, all of our webinars can be found on our site, as well as lots and lots of information, case studies, how-tos, blogs, all of our events coming up. And we have a lot of great webinars planned. Our next session within this webinar series will focus on cost optimization in AWS. We also have a great webinar coming up on January 30th with a special guest talking about how to avoid nightmare on AWS Street. So please go check out our BrightTalk channel, save your seats, our event page on our site, and come join us. And we'll sign off here. Have a great day, everyone. Take care.